Good morning. This morning's webinar is on the subject of ISO 45001 2018. We're going to provide an overview of the changes in this standard. Give everyone another minute or two to see if anyone else will join us. In the meantime, my name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. Welcome. Our agenda for today, we will cover a little bit about PJR and what we do, some of the benefits and drivers for certification. We'll talk about the transition timeline for this standard for anyone who is certified to OSAS 18001, 2007, and will be transitioning to this new standard that will replace OSAS 18001. We'll talk about what that transition timeline looks like. At a high level, we'll go through the key changes of this standard, and then we'll do a more in-depth clause-by-clause overview of some of the more significant changes. There's a couple other related documents that coincide with the release of this standard. We'll cover those briefly as well. For anyone who is seeking certification for the first time to ISO 45001, meaning you're not transitioning from OSAS 18001, you are coming in as a new registration, we'll go through what the certification process looks like. And at the end, we'll have a few minutes for questions, so feel free to type those in to the question section at any point during the presentation, and we will get to those at the end. Today's presentation is being recorded, so in a day or two on PJR's website, you'll be able to access both the slides themselves and a recording of the webinar if you'd like. That will be available on PJR's website. Okay, so PJR is a registrar, obviously. We're one of the leading registrars, and this is not an all-inclusive list, but certainly gives you an idea of the variety of countries in which we offer certification to various standards. We are accredited to grant certification for a variety of standards. I'm not sure that this is even a complete list, but certainly gives you an idea. And we are pursuing accreditation to ISO 45001. Currently, we are approved to conduct audits to the standard. And once we receive our accreditation, we will be able to grant those certifications. In general, some of the benefits of a certification such as ISO 45001 include helping an organization meet their legal and other requirements, their compliance criteria, improving the organization's health and safety performance. In other words, providing a safer environment in which to do business, whether it's for employees or visitors or contractors or anyone who may be within the facility or exposed to the activities and services performed by the facility. A standard like this drives management commitment and employee engagement as you go through the process of implementing the requirements of the standard. There can be business management benefits, including meeting stakeholder requirements, improving the organization's public image, achieving strategic objectives that the organization may have even at a very high level, and the ability to integrate this standard, this management system with other business management systems. A certification like this can also drive improvements or changes to supplier health and safety performance through the flow down of some of these requirements or the communication of some of these requirements, monitoring of the supplier's performance, tracking any nonconformities, things like that. Holding certifications such as these can sometimes provide a competitive advantage as well. If you are bidding for work, for example, and you hold a certification that your competitors don't hold, that can provide an advantage. By addressing the risks and improving the health and safety performance, you're also minimizing the risk of production delays by identifying where the risks are and placing, different monitoring and operational controls in place to prevent them. And occasionally there can be financial benefits besides providing a competitive advantage or improving your public image, maybe getting business that you would not have earned otherwise. Sometimes especially for health and safety standards, there can be possible cost savings from insurance premiums or fines that you might receive otherwise from different regulatory bodies. Obviously, since ISO 45001 is a health and safety standard, the drivers are mostly specific to health and safety, and they overlap with what we talked about on the last screen. It's really about a commitment to occupational health and safety, preventing injuries and ill health, like I said, for employees, contractors, visitors, anyone who could be impacted. As I mentioned earlier, ISO 45001-2018 replaces the OSAS 18001-2007 standard. So OSAS 18001 will be discontinued once the transition period has closed. There will be no new certifications to that standard. It will be phased out. This standard defines the requirements for establishing, implementing, and maintaining an occupational health and safety management system, also known as an OHSMS. And this framework that the standard requires or represents allows an organization to control its hazards, reduce its risks and/or downtime, and improve both its processes and its operations. So we're going to see several references to OHSMS in this presentation, and the theme obviously being preventing injury and ill health and improving the health and safety performance of the organization. ISO 45001 was published in March 2018, and it is a voluntary certification for most organizations. Every once in a while, we see clients whose upstreams or downstreams or customers may require that they hold some type of certification like this, but it's certainly not required by a regulatory body, so it is considered a voluntary certification. As with most standards, the transition period will be 3 years for existing certifications based on the publication date of March 2018. So any existing OSAS 18001 certificates that were set to expire after that will be revised to reflect the expiration date, the end of the transition period. If we haven't already done so, I'd have to go back and check. PJR will be issuing a transition plan to any and all existing OSAS 18001 clients that we have to communicate the deadlines based on the publication of the standard. Something to keep in mind is that in order to avoid a lapse in certification, we need to make sure that the transition audit takes place early enough for all of the certification decision activities to be performed before that transition deadline, before the expiration of the existing OSAS 18001 certificates, So to that end, PJR may communicate a deadline by which your audit must occur. What this means is any audits that take place after that deadline, we can't guarantee there wouldn't be a lapse. The certification decision activities include sufficient time after the audit for appropriate corrective action responses to be obtained from the client and approved by the auditor, for the package to be reviewed internally, and for a certification decision to be made, a draft certificate to be issued to the client and approved before a final certificate can be issued. So if you're provided with a deadline for this transition audit and you decide to have your audit take place after that deadline, PJR will not guarantee that there won't be a lapse, since all of those activities take time. And what that means is that you could have your OSAS 18001 certificate expire before you have a 45001 certificate issued. So in that period, however brief, you're technically not certified. You would have to stop advertising the certification if you advertise, and things like that. The transition plan for ISO 45001 allows the transition audit to take place during either a surveillance or a recertification audit based on the client's scheduled cycle and their preference. However, it requires that at least one audit day be added to ensure that all of the transition requirements are reviewed. So that is not optional. We have to add at least one audit day, whether your transition audit is taking place during a surveillance or a recertification audit. Here we have a visual timeline to give you an idea of what the transition period looks like. So as I said, we have the March 2018 publication of the standard, and we are allowed to audit to ISO 45001 at this time. We have trained our auditors, and we have trained auditors available to start conducting those audits. After the end of 2019, we will not offer any new certifications to OSAS 18001. So if you are looking to be certified and you have already started developing your documentation to OSAS 18001 and you'd like to get certified to that before you transition, your audit will need to take place before that deadline. After that, we won't offer any new clients or new certifications to OSAS 18001. After June 1st of 2020, we won't audit to OSAS 18001 anymore at all. So after that period, you have to start transitioning. This would be the deadline to have another surveillance audit to OSAS 18001. If you want to wait, one more year, you would have to schedule prior to this deadline if you're looking to wait that extra year. Here is the deadline for transition audits to prevent a lapse. So since the 3-year transition deadline ends, or the 3-year transition period ends March 2021, we're looking for all audits to be conducted prior to the beginning of December to ensure or to guarantee no lapse in certification, as we discussed on the previous slides. So if you're looking to have one more surveillance or recertification audit to OSAS 18001, it'll have to be before this date, and then you'll find you need to have another audit very quickly after that to transition to the new standard to avoid a lapse. So you have to look at your certification cycle, when your audits are normally due in the year, and determine what is best, what's going to work best for you. Your scheduler can certainly help with this process. And again, these slides with this timeline will be available on PJR's website for your reference. ISO 45001, the standard itself, now reflects the Annex SL structure, which if any of you are familiar with the revisions that have been made to ISO 9001 and ISO 14001, this will look familiar. This is a common structure across the ISO standards so that they follow the same format and can be more easily integrated. That is part of the reason why ISO 45001 was developed and the health and safety standard was revised to continue to align with the other standards and make integration more seamless. This represents the clause structure, and we'll go through some of those clauses. A couple small changes to the Plan, Do, Check, Act model as well. You can find this graphic within the standard. At a high level, the key changes in ISO 45001 are the adoption of the Annex SL structure, which we just looked at on the last slides, to continue to align with the other standards commonly integrated. There is a definite emphasis on leadership and accountability, which we will talk about. There's a focus on risk management and a proactive approach to risk management. There's an emphasis on objectives measurement and change, looking at continual improvement of the performance, the organization's OHS performance. There are some changes to the communication and awareness requirements. And overall, the standard is a bit less prescriptive in dictating which procedures need to be documented and things of that nature, giving the organization a bit more flexibility in how they meet the requirements of the standard. There are some changes and some new terms. We're not going to take the time to go through these. They are part of the slides. You can reference by either downloading the slides or watching the recording and pausing as you'd like to read. These are certainly found within the standard as well, so you can reference your standard. I included the ones that have changed or are new, so these would be worth reviewing when you get some time. Interested parties are previously known as stakeholders. This again aligns with the Annex SL structure and the other standards to adopt common verbiage. It's important to point out that the intended outcomes of the OHSMS are to prevent injury and ill health and to provide a safe and healthy workplace. So we're going to see this phrase, intended outcomes, throughout the presentation. This is really emphasized within the ISO 45001 in terms of monitoring or gauging the performance of the management system. We're really looking at whether or not these intended outcomes are being met. We have definitions for top management and risks and opportunities, which is a new term in the Annex SL structure, worth familiarizing yourself with if you're not already familiar. Documented information is also new to the Annex SL structure in terms of giving organizations greater flexibility to determine what forms or what formats or media make sense for them as far as maintaining documents and records. So this term replaces both documents and records, meaning whatever format works best for the organization, giving greater flexibility there. There's some more specificity added to the audit definition. Okay, all right. So we'll get into some of the more detailed changes related to ISO 45001. We are certainly looking at strategic planning. When we're talking about greater leadership, involvement, and accountability, we're also looking at what the organization's strategic plan looks like and how it incorporates the requirements or the goals associated with an OHS standard like ISO 45001, there should be increased prominence of these health and safety topics within management and the organization's strategic planning. And leadership has been given its own clause. If you look back at the Annex SL structure slide, you see that leadership is a clause within and of itself, because again, the involvement and the accountability of leadership is really stressed. Proactivity is also stressed within the standard. The expectations for organizations are increased. Proactive initiatives, proactive identification of risk management versus reactive actions or reactive measures taken after an incident or near miss or injury has occurred. We're really looking for that proactivity to identify the hazards and risks and place controls or monitoring in place before someone actually gets hurt. Okay, and we already talked about documented information being a new term that covers both documents and records and aligns with the Annex SL structure that we see in ISO 9001 and ISO 14001, giving organizations greater flexibility to determine what works for them. Going through clause by clause, starting with clause 4, we look at the context of the organization, determining and understanding what that context is. And this is relevant to the OHSMS's ability to achieve its intended outcomes. So again, we look at that intended outcomes definition, and you'll see a lot of the requirements come back to the intended outcomes of the system. So what are those internal and external issues that are relevant to the management system and its ability to achieve its intended outcomes? Who are the interested parties that are relevant? We're not just talking about workers and employees here. And what are their needs and expectations? Once you identify who the relevant interested parties are and what their needs and expectations are, you'll find that a lot of those needs and expectations translate into requirements for the management system. And all of this needs to be included and considered when determining the scope of the management system. So again, it's relevant to achieving its intended outcomes, but all of that is taken into consideration. Clause 5 focuses on leadership as well as worker participation. So at a high level, first and foremost, top management is ultimately responsible for the management system. Whether they take on the responsibilities directly or delegate some of those roles, they are ultimately responsible. The health and safety policy needs to align with the organization's strategic direction, developed at least in part with top management, and the system's ability to achieve its intended outcomes. And a new requirement in this standard, in the verbiage that has to be included, is a commitment to participation. And we'll talk more about participation in a later slide. Oh, the next slide. So as I mentioned, top management is ultimately accountable for the OHSMS. A management representative is not explicitly mentioned in the standard. It's certainly still allowable. But what that means is that the responsibilities associated with managing the system can be delegated to one individual or a team of individuals. That's really up to the organization depending on their size and who's responsible for what. And again, while top management can delegate these responsibilities, they're ultimately accountable for the management system. And during audits, we'll be looking for evidence of that. Clause 5.4 covers participation and consultation of workers. So this section is more specific and more prescriptive in terms of providing considerations for the organization, what needs to be identified or controlled, such as clearly identifying the methods for participation and consultation, what training or resources are needed, identifying and removing or minimizing, if you can't remove, any barriers to participation. So this can cover a lot of different things, and it really depends on the organization. Sometimes there is fear of reprisal. People are worried about coming forward to provide information about risks or complain about anything. They're worried about losing their job or having some negative backlash. Sometimes there's language barrier. Sometimes there is a lack of follow-through that conveys that the participation results aren't being reviewed or utilized, and that the process is sort of pointless. So again, just the theme of this standard is being more proactive. So identifying and removing, if possible, any barriers to participation is added in this version of the standard. It also emphasizes non-manager participation in various topics and areas: identification of risk, operational control, implementation or identification, incident investigations, things like that. What this means is certainly supervisors and managers are relevant to those processes and can provide input, but this requirement in the standard, this section of the standard, is really meant to involve the day-to-day employees who are doing those jobs. If they're working on the equipment, if they're wearing the PPE, if they're working around the various hazards, the idea is that they're a resource to be utilized in terms of identifying risks where they exist, assessing what operational controls may be effective, investigating an incident that has occurred, things like that. The next clause is clause 6, and it covers planning. This section has been completely restructured. And planning and risk determination are intended in this standard to take into consideration both positive and negative hazards or aspects, meaning if you go back to the terms slides or the definition section of the standard, you'll see definitions for risks and opportunities, and those represent both positive and negative. Also taking into consideration the needs and expectations of interested parties that we discussed in clause 4, with a focus on achieving the intended outcomes of the system. And again, that's a term that we reviewed early on in the standard. The risks and opportunities need to be determined in order to ensure that the management system can achieve its intended outcomes, prevent or minimize any undesired effects such as injuries and ill health, and continually improve itself. We're looking for risks and opportunities related to the hazards themselves, any legal and other requirements that would be applicable, and those risks and opportunities are, again, reflective of what can affect the management system's achievement of intended outcomes. So it would have to be relevant in that way. Clause 6.1.2.1, hazard identification, has some more prescriptive and proactive requirements for consideration as part of the hazard identification process. Some of these additional requirements for consideration may include people in the nearby area who can be affected by the organization, people at the workplace who are not controlled by the organization, the work area itself, the designs of the equipment, any actual or proposed changes that could affect the health and safety management system, past incidents, those are just a couple examples, but the idea here is that we're also not just focusing on the employees themselves. There are visitors, there are contractors who come into the workplace who could be affected by these risks and hazards. In some cases, we see organizations have maybe they utilize temporary employees where a staffing agency or a temp agency is responsible for those employees and provides oversight. Sometimes that can cause a disconnect or the perspective that the temps are not relevant to the management system, but that is not intended to be the case with ISO 45001. If they're working in that same area, if they can be impacted by the activities of the organization, then those are risks and opportunities or hazards that need to be considered. Can also be people in the nearby area. So depending on the activities or the industry, people outside of the building can be affected as well. Noise, different equipment that you have coming and going, transportation and things like that. The storage of chemicals or fuels and the potential for a large explosion or spill or something like that. So it really just depends on the industry and the activities, but all of that needs to be proactively considered. This section goes on to differentiate between the risks and opportunities, and as I mentioned, they represent both positive and negative criteria, with an emphasis on being proactive in your approach. And with all requirements in the standard, we're looking for documented information to show that that portion of the standard has been implemented. And that can take many forms. The standard still requires that any applicable legal and other requirements be identified. So we're not just looking for what applies, what legal and other requirements apply. We're also looking for a clear determination of how the requirements apply. So how do they impact the organization? What do they require the organization to do? And how do they relate to the hazards and risks? In some cases, there are communication requirements associated with those legal and other requirements. You may be required to communicate injuries that take place in a certain way, or releases, or different permit violations. It just depends on the specific legal requirements, but taking a look at how communication comes into play is also relevant. And there's a note here that's found within the standard that legal and other requirements can result in risks and or opportunities. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Going through the process of identifying the legal and other requirements, you may find some of those translate to risks and opportunities that need to be addressed within the management system. Once you've identified all the risks, opportunities, legal and other requirements, things like that, we're looking to see that you've planned actions accordingly. You also need to take into account, as with OSAS 18001, the hierarchy of controls, which is found in 8.1.2 and has not significantly changed from the last, from the version in OSAS 18001, if you're familiar with that. Clause 6.2 covers objectives and planning to achieve them. So there is some bullet points to be considered or included when identifying the objectives. These aren't really new. And then take planning actions to achieve those objectives. Again, there's items that need to be determined and documented in some way. So maintaining documented information as evidence of having determined these items. How How are the objectives going to be achieved? What actions or tasks are needed? Who is responsible? What resources are needed? When will they can be completed by? How will they be monitored? Things like that. Clause 7 covers support. As I mentioned, competency and awareness are covered in this section, and they've actually been separated into two separate subclauses, with awareness criteria being more prescriptive than in the previous standard. We see an emphasis on communication, which we'll talk about, and this is the section where you can find more information on the documented information as well. So the competence clause focuses on determining competency requirements for workers that can affect the performance of the OHSMS. So again, this is reflective or as relevant to their ability to affect the performance of the OHSMS or the management system's ability to achieve its intended outcomes. And we need to see documented information as evidence of competence. We're also looking for evidence that effectiveness of these actions has been verified. So if you identify a competency requirement and you close that gap through training or some other process, those actions also need to be evaluated for effectiveness. In terms of awareness, the standard identifies specific items or topics that workers need to be made aware of by the organization, including the ramifications of deviating from the management system requirements. That's an important one. There are sections for both internal and external communication. There are not any significant changes in the internal communication section, so I've skipped that, but the external communication section is now separated out and requires the OHSMS to determine those internal and external requirements for communication that are relevant. So who needs to be communicated with, by when, in what way. This depends really on the industry and the organization, but going through the process of determining that is important. And those interested party views or requirements that we talked about earlier can come into play again here. If they have requirements for what they want to have communicated to them, we'll see this come up again. As I mentioned, specific controls for documented information need to be identified, and this is similar to in the previous OSAS 18001 standard. It's similar to control of documents to make sure that changes are controlled, outdated versions are made inaccessible or clearly identified as obsolete, that you don't have multiple versions of a document being utilized. And it also includes the record control requirements, such as how are records stored, what records are required, things like that. But we use the term documented information now to address them as a whole. Clause 8 focuses on operations. Any planned actions have to have established process criteria with documented information to show meeting the requirements. As I mentioned before, 8.1.2 holds the hierarchy of controls, and there are no significant changes there. However, there is a new section, 8.1.3, that covers management of change. This was intended in the previous version of the standard, but the language was not clear, and this was not always put in place. So the language is much stronger in ISO 45001, and this relates to having a process to review and identify any potential changes to a system, to the OHSMS, before a change is implemented. So looking at the impact that new products services or processes, new equipment, changes to equipment, changes to working conditions, changing legal requirements, anything relevant to the OHSMS, reviewing those changes and how they could affect the management system and the performance, the health and safety performance of the organization before those changes are introduced to the workplace. So again, this is proactive in nature instead of reacting to a change that has already occurred. Under the procurement section, we see some different subclauses focusing on outsourcing. We look at what that process looks like, how outsourced processes are going to be controlled, again, as relevant to their potential impact on the OHS performance. This includes contractors, identifying and controlling risks associated with activities to the contractors. So this could have to do with what kind of work the contractors are going to be doing on site, with what equipment, chemicals, what have you, and the impact that can have on the organization's employees, or vice versa. What are the contractors going to be exposed to based on what the organization's workers are doing? We're also looking for criteria related to how contractors are selected and how the organization makes sure that the contractor's activities are still meeting the requirements of the health and safety management system. Just because the work is outsourced doesn't mean that it's not relevant to the management system, that their performance can't have an impact on the performance of the management system, or that it's out of the control of the organization and whatever the contractors do, they're going to do. Besides contractors, just in general, like I said, we're looking at controls to outsourcing, whether you're procuring materials or different services. We're looking at how that's relevant to the management system and the intended outcomes of the system. There aren't significant changes to 8.2 emergency response, but there are some additional considerations added to the standards, more bullet points, things to consider and potentially include in your emergency response procedure or plan, or whatever that process looks like. Clause 9 reflects performance evaluation, including monitoring and measurement. In general, certainly we're talking about monitoring and measurement, and then there are more specific implementations of that, such as the internal audit. So we're looking for how these items are being monitored, how they're evaluating the effectiveness of the management system. And then in terms of internal audits, we're looking at what specific factors have been determined within the audit program. So the audit program has to be maybe more specific than it was before. Ensuring that the results of the internal audit are reported to relevant parties. So this information is meant to be shared and communicated. And there are also additional inputs and outputs required as part of the management review process for these health and safety management system reviews that are performed by top management. The last clause in the standard is clause 10, focusing on improvement. And this is where we see opportunities for improvement. This has been added back into the standard. It was removed in some of the other revised standards, but it is present in ISO 45001, looking for opportunities for improvement. 10.2 covers incidents, nonconformities, and corrective actions, requiring timely action to address any incidents and nonconformities. This includes near misses. You want to take a look at the definition for incidents and make sure that you are responding adequately to all types of incidents. and nonconformities. Corrective actions need to be reviewed for effectiveness and have evidence accordingly, and that's where we see that documented information definition come into play. So you're going to need to be able to show what you did for those corrective actions and how you verified effectiveness of those actions. And again, as with management review, the results need to be reported to relevant parties. So in the case of incident investigation or corrective actions, the results need to be reported to relevant workers or interested parties depending on the nature of the incident or issue that is meant to be communicated. The last subclause talks about continual improvement, which again, we're looking for improvement of the performance of the management system, and that relates to meeting the intended outcomes. Maintaining a culture that supports the health and safety management system, supports participation of workers, communication of results as relevant, and really maintaining that evidence, that documented information of any actions taken or improvements made to the management system as a whole. At the end of the standard, you find Annex A, which is guidance on how to use the document, and the bibliography. We're not going to go through those today. But as I mentioned, there were some documents that came out concurrent with the ISO 45001 standard or intended to be implemented at the same time. These are IAF mandatory documents, and these are more relevant for us as a registrar. However, since some of the requirements flow down to the clients and the organizations, I wanted to include that in these slides and go through a couple of those expectations. So one of the requirements in these documents is related to notification of significant changes. So this is something that's already in place. If PJR is your registrar or whoever your registrar may be, you're required to notify us of significant changes. If you're moving facilities, if you have a change in management representative, or you've added another shift, or a change in employee count, significant employee count change, any significant changes are required to be communicated. But this really steps up that requirement in that you need to notify us in writing ASAP. This isn't something that can wait until the next audit to tell your auditor to relay to PJR. A lot of times it has an impact on audit time or the audit planning activities, and it can be challenging to scramble during the audit to react to these changes. Sometimes more audit time is needed, and with the auditor's travel already being booked, there can be some pretty heavy fees associated with changing the travel arrangements and things like that, or by then, the auditor's schedule may be pretty full and it can be challenging to accommodate additional audit time. Those are just a couple quick examples, but the point is that any significant changes need to be communicated to PJR in writing as soon as possible. This isn't something that you want to sit on until your next audit and then bring up at that time again. So thinking in terms of proactivity and management of change, please do let us know of any significant changes. These documents came with a prescribed audit table based on risk level and employee count, which we already have had for the majority of the other standards, but for some reason, health and safety didn't necessarily have their own. So this is something that as a registrar, we're required to comply with now, and you will likely see your audit time increase as a result. So I wanted to note that this is a prescriptive requirement that we are required to follow. It is not our intent to increase your audit time, but that will be something that may change when you transition, or in the near future, you may see an increase in your health and safety audit time because of this prescribed audit table. In conjunction with an emphasis on top management involvement and accountability, these mandatory documents emphasize that Top management should be involved in the audits. And that can take on many forms, but specifically, it mentions top management should be in attendance for the closing meeting. The closing meeting is arguably the most important part of the audit because it's a summary of how the audit went, the status of the management system, the findings, the strengths, the weaknesses, the outcomes, what happens next, any follow-up activities that are required, the opportunity to ask questions, things like that. So this prescribes that if top management isn't in attendance, whether physically or over the phone or something like that, a reasonable excuse for their absence needs to be documented within the audit report. And if it isn't a sufficient excuse, that would be a violation of that intent, that top management is involved and accountable and aware of the management system and everything it takes to operate that system. So that's something to keep an eye out for and think about if that applies to you or is going to be an issue for your organization. Starting to make that shift now, make top management aware that their involvement is really important so that they can start shifting in that direction. These documents also give certification bodies like PJR the ability to conduct special audits in response to compliance issues or incidents, things like that, and potentially even suspend or withdraw certifications depending on the scenario and the severity of the potential gap in the management system. And this verbiage will be included in the terms and conditions of the contract that you sign with PJR or any registrar. It's in there that we reserve the right to do that. But these IAF mandatory documents just make that a little bit clearer. Similarly, any legal compliance violations or gaps could potentially prevent or impede the issuance of a certification. If you are pursuing certification for the first time and you've had some compliance violations or gaps associated with health and safety requirements, you may see additional action needed or holding off on issuing a certificate until sufficient objective evidence has been obtained that those issues have been closed and that the management system is capable of preventing something like that from happening again in the future. And that's really a case-by-case basis, but again, it's just something that we want to make you guys aware of. So overall, these changes, if you can't sense a theme, is that ISO 45001 is really raising the bar a bit from OSAS 18001 and the previous versions of the standard, requiring the system and the organization to be more proactive in their approach. Okay, just really quickly while we have a few more minutes, for anyone who is pursuing certification for the first time and is not familiar with what that process looks like, I'll go through that and then we'll have a couple minutes for questions. So the first step, if you are pursuing certification for the first time, would be to establish your documentation that meets the requirements of the standard. Obviously, you'll need a copy of the standard for that. You'll want to conduct any training that the management system requires and implement any requirements of the standard, including conducting your internal audit, your compliance evaluation, and your management review after the internal audit. Then you'll need to contract with a certification body like PJR. And you will have a stage 1 and a stage 2 audit, which we'll talk about on the next slide a little bit more, address any nonconformities that result from the stage 2, and then you can be issued a certificate. So more specifically, the stage 1 is a documentation review. So we're looking at the framework, the documentation framework. Are the processes in place to meet the requirements of the standard. Do they meet the requirements of the standard? Evaluating your readiness to proceed to stage 2. Stage 2 is an audit of the entire system, and we're looking at the implementation of those requirements, those processes, those procedures, those documents. Is the framework implemented, and does it meet the requirements of the standard effectively? So we'll assess the entire system before approving you for certification. Any nonconformities issued during the stage 2 need to be resolved prior to a certificate issuance. So you'll see a corrective action process there, responding to the findings. Depending on whether they're minor or major, you would have to demonstrate implementation of those changes or corrections for the finding to be closed out for a major. And then once those are resolved and accepted, you can be issued a certificate. Certificates are good for 3 years. So in between the stage 2 and the recertification audit, which is the 3-year cycle, you'll have surveillance audits in between. And these can be either annual or semi-annual, depending on the contract or your preference. And those are a partial system audit in that it's not the full system audit that we see at stage 2. We'll cover some of the processes. Some of the management system processes get audited every time, but some of the core processes or what the organization actually does can be sampled throughout those surveillance audits. And then on the 3rd year, you'll have your recertification audit, which is the same idea as the stage 2 audit, where it's a full system audit of the implementation and the effectiveness of the system, covering all the processes, and then would result again in the issuance of a new certificate, good for 3 years, starting that cycle over again. I included this slide here that you can review if it's relevant to you if you have more than one location. Sometimes it makes more sense for each site to be certified separately, and other times it makes sense to have a multi-site certification where they're included on one certificate and they're sampled throughout the audits. The different locations are sampled and not necessarily all audited each time. There are pros and cons to that approach, so we can certainly work with you during the quoting phase to figure out what is going to work best for your organization if that applies to you. As I mentioned early in the presentation, the management system can also be integrated with other management systems, meaning you can possibly be being audited to other standards at the same time. And I also included this slide to give you a little bit more information on how that might work. If you are looking to have your audits done concurrently and your system is integrated, we can sometimes provide discounts for that integration, meaning if the management systems are combined, if the internal audits are done together, if the documentation covers both standards, if your management review covers both standards, that would be, some examples of integration, in which case we can sometimes discount audit time and save you some money that way. But for that to apply, they need to be integrated, and if we were to find that they weren't, then that discount would not be applicable. Okay, I went through that pretty quickly, but I wanted to make sure we had time for questions. So I'm going to just go to the next slide with my contact information on it in the meantime, and I will look and see if we have any questions. But should you think of questions after the presentation, or if you have more specific scenarios that you'd like to talk through, my information is right here. You can contact me via email. I also have PJR's EHS Program Manager on here, Nancy. Here's her email address as well, if you'd like to contact us for more information or any questions you may have. If you're looking for a quote, if you're pursuing certification for the first time, here's the number for our sales department, and they can help you with that process. And if you are already a client, and again, you're looking to understand where and when you want to transition, your scheduler can help start that process for you. Excuse me. Okay. Let's see if we have any questions. Could you give some examples of activities to implement to satisfy management commitment and leadership accountability? Let's see. So if we go back to that section of the standard, we're looking for management to take on responsibility for the effectiveness, the integration of the management with other processes, the adequacy of resources, and the communication of conformance to the system. So resource allocation is a big one. Who's responsible for what, making sure the responsibilities are delegated, the resources are adequate, those individuals responsible for the management system have sufficient resources to maintain the management system. Their involvement or awareness in the internal audit outputs, the participation in management reviews, like I said, participation in our third-party audits and the closing meetings. Let's see. We talked about making sure that responsibilities and authorities are assigned and adequate. The overall emphasis of the management system, how important it is, how the ramifications of deviating from it or aligning the requirements of the management system with the strategic direction of the organization so that it's not just, a separate assignment or a piece of paper, the certificate hanging on the wall. It's, a core value of the organization or part of their intent for the system overall. That would be a couple examples. It really depends on the size of the organization sometimes and how many people are part of top management, how spread out they are. Sometimes we see top management, as an owner involved in the day-to-day, running of a company compared to when top management is traveling between various sites and maybe less tangible. So it's really going to vary by organization. But certainly if you have more specific questions, we could talk about that offline. Okay, we have a question about the difference between internal audits and management reviews. So again, you can look at the definitions in the standard and we could talk more offline if that's not helpful, but the internal audit is an audit done either by competent auditors within your organization or an outsourced third party, maybe a consulting group or an auditing group, separate from a registrar like PJR to self-audit your management system and whether you're meeting the requirements of the standard. So it would be a full system, process-based audit of your entire organization and an assessment of whether or not it's meeting the requirements of the ISO 45001 standard. Sometimes nonconformities would be identified and they would need to be put through your corrective action process. The management review clause, if you look at that section of the standard, is a meeting of some sort where you're covering prescribed inputs and outputs to review the management system as a whole, the adequacy of the policy, of the resources, what's the status on the objectives that we have, what's the status on any open incidents or nonconformities, things like that. It's pretty prescriptive as far as what it needs to cover. And the frequency is something that can be determined by the organization. And then we have someone who would like to see the multi-site slide again. And again, these slides will be available for you to download off after the presentation is done. But a multi-site would be, for example, several locations where you have maybe a headquarters and then several processing facilities who do the same types of activities. This is different from a campus scheme where each site is doing something different and together they form a whole or form perform the activities. Multi-site would be several locations doing the same thing. So if your process is manufacturing of some type of item and you've got 4 locations that are doing that activity, you might be eligible for a multi-site, in which case those different sites can be sampled and all listed on the certificate. The downside of that is if one of the sites performs poorly enough, it could cost the entire group their certificate. But certainly that's something that we could talk through more, like I said, during the quoting or working with sales to determine what may work best for your organization. Okay, thank you for your questions. I'll wait another minute to see if we have any more, but if not, again, my contact information is on this last slide. Okay, we have one more question. If there's an independent coffee shop within the company, how should it be approached in terms of hazards and risks? So at a high level, the most applicable sections to consider anything like that would be at the beginning, looking at 4.3 when we are talking about the scope and the context of the organization. So that would potentially be within the scope to assess if there are aspects of that coffee shop or whatever the other company that's co-located may be can have on the management system, and vice versa. You know, what impact can your activities have on the coffee shop? So you would consider those issues in 4.3, and then again in 6.1.2.1. Anything that's determined to be within the scope or potentially impacting one way or the other, you would be assessing those risks, those hazards in 6.1.2.1 to see what, if any, impact there could be, what controls might be necessary, things like that. So I'm not necessarily saying that a coffee shop will result in risks and hazards for your organization, but it's something that you need to consider, and it could result in different hazards or risks and opportunities for your organization or your organization's impact on the other companies there. For example, if you have a couple companies co-located maybe in a open warehouse or close enough that they have activities that are really loud, you know, a high decibel level can affect your employees just as much as theirs if that's carrying over into your area. Just because it's not your company or your equipment making that noise doesn't mean it's not impacting your employees, your workers, and anyone who's in the vicinity of your organization. So it needs to at least be considered. Okay, that looks like all the questions we have today. Thank you again for joining us. The slides and the recording will be available on PGR's website within the within a day or two, I would say. And certainly if you have any other questions, you can reach out to us directly via email or by calling the main PGR number, and we'd be happy to assist you. Good luck with your transition if you're transitioning from OSAS 18001 to ISO 45001. And if you're new to the certification process, welcome, and I hope that PGR will be able to assist you. Let's see. We have a question about a shared facility with secure barriers between businesses. Are we responsible for their issues? Again, it really depends on the facility and the industry and who's doing what. So you're responsible for considering the impact in 4.3 and 6.1.2.1, whether that translates to hazards or risks for your system or not. That's part of your assessment. That's part of the process that you need to go through to determine that. I'm not sure, Marcello, what you're looking for as far as a slide of multi-site internal conditions, but feel free to email me specific questions. And same with your next question, internal audits, level of integration, etc. Again, I'm not sure exactly what you mean, so feel free to shoot me an email. And again, thank you all of you for joining me this morning, and good luck with your audits.